Hello, humans. My name is Luke Wildman, and I am a sci-fi and fantasy author. I have won second place in the Writers of the Future contest, which is one of the preeminent contests for aspiring authors who are just trying to build a foundation for their careers. So I have a bunch of friends who are also aspiring writers who have asked for tips on how to find success in the contest. So today I'm going to be answering a few questions from other people I know who are hoping to do well in Writers of the Future. Their websites will be posted in the comments on the video, so make sure to check those out. A lot of them have had some success and are cool people with good resources. So my first question comes from Hope Bullinger, and she asks, what are some common mistakes to avoid when submitting to a contest? For this, I'm going to talk about contests in general, not really Writers of the Future in particular. So the first thing I'll say is make sure that you follow the submission guidelines really precisely. The easiest way for an editor to weed out a story from the thousands of submissions they get is if that story does not follow their guidelines and their rules for formatting and for self-editing and everything like that. For Writers of the Future, for example, the stories are judged blind, so you can't have any identifying info on any of your pages. You can't have your address or your name on anything. Make absolutely certain that you are not including any of that information. The second thing is make sure that you're reading past editions of whatever contest you're submitting to. So for Writers of the Future, make sure you're reading some of the past anthologies, especially some of the recent anthologies, because that way you can figure out the tone and style of what you're submitting to. For other contests or magazines, make sure you're reading issues of the magazines. It's both a great way for you to do market research and also a great way for you to support the publication and not just be trying to get something out of it. The third thing for this is make sure that you have a polished and a completed manuscript. You wouldn't believe how many people just submit their first draft with a ton of typos and a ton of errors. And again, this is a really easy way for an editor to just weed out the story. It doesn't really matter, honestly, if the story itself is great. If it has a ton of typos, it's going to take more effort for their team. And so you want to make sure that you're helping out their team as much as possible. All right, my second question is from Alex Mellen. And she asks, have you picked up any intangibles the contest likes in a story? Certain story themes or character types or point of views that are preferred? So that's a great question. So I've been submitting to this contest for 4 years. That's a lot of submissions. I did a lot of analysis of the stories, and I also used the feedback that I would get from the judges to figure out what was working for them, what they wanted more of, and what was kind of a dead end. The first thing I'll say is they seem to like non-human point of view characters. So if you are capable of writing a really effective and convincing an alien or some sort of mythic deity, writing from their perspective, and yet still making them relatable, that will be really memorable to the judges. So that is a really good way to make your story stand out. And I should say, all of these answers I'm giving here, they are my personal observations on the contest. So it's very possible that the judges or other people who've had success will disagree with me. But these are my observations. And again, I've had a lot of experience submitting to this, so I think these are pretty good bets. So along with using non-human point of view characters, I know that the contest, I know for a fact that they never get enough comedy, especially in the year of COVID. The judges were getting a lot of darker submissions, a lot of more serious stuff, which is great and important. But at the same time, I wanted to give them something that I knew that the judges personally would enjoy and a lot of their readers would enjoy, and would just be sort of some levity during a pretty dark year. So if you're capable of writing comedy, go for it. Along those same lines, I know that the judges get more fantasy submissions than sci-fi. I've read that. And I don't want to discourage you from submitting fantasy because most of what I submitted was fantasy. I love fantasy. They also get more space opera than they get hard science fiction. So it's just sort of a guideline. Fantasy and space opera can do very well in this contest. But if you can write a really hard science, well-researched story that doesn't bog readers down in the details of the science, I think that you could do really well. My third question comes from Demelza Ramirez, and she asks, the rules say they don't consider works intended for children. What is their definition of this? Does YA fall under that category? Great question, and I actually wanted to make sure that I was going to be giving you the right information for this, so I reached out to John Goodwin, who is one of the head honchos over at Galaxy Press, the publisher of the Writers of the Future anthologies. And he told me that the Writers of the Future reading level starts at 9th grade and goes up from there. So YA is absolutely fine, because most YA falls above a 9th grade reading level. So just don't write anything that is specifically intended for children. Don't probably shy away from middle grade as well. The flip side of this is, even though the books have a more adult audience, you want to make sure that you are not writing something that is only for adults, because these books do go into school libraries. So make sure that you're not getting too graphic with any of the violence or any of the sex or the swearing, anything like that. Make sure that it can go for a wide range of audiences. And that is not a moral judgment on the part of Writers of the Future. It is a market judgment from them. All right, so my third question is from Janelle Crouch, and she asks, do they typically have any preference between plot-driven and character-driven stories? In my experience, each story should be a good mix of both. So Writers of the Future was founded by L. Ron Hubbard. He founded it as a way for aspiring authors to build careers for themselves. And so, L. Ron Hubbard was one of the preeminent writers of the pulp, sci-fi, and fantasy markets back in the day. So it has its roots very firmly in genre fiction, in sci-fi and fantasy. But in recent years, the contest has gone more towards the literary character-driven side of things, especially under the current coordinating judge, Dave Wolverton. He really looks for stories that have strong character arcs and strong narrative voices. You should have both in there. If you're going to shy towards one end of the spectrum or the other, I would say shy towards character-driven stories. And the reason I say that, not just for this contest, but in general, is because a memorable character is going to really stand out in readers' minds more than a great twist. You want to have great twists in there, but if you're choosing one or the other, having a great character is going to relate to the reader and it's going to grab the reader more. When I was submitting to Writers of the Future, I decided that I wanted to use it both as a way to build my career and my platform, but also to build myself up creatively. Because Writers of the Future, they have quarterly deadlines. So what I did was for every other deadline, I would write something that was stretching myself creatively, something that was a little more experimental. It would have like a second person narration from the perspective of death, or it would have some sort of urban fantasy mythic element that was getting kind of meta with its story structure. And then on the other ones, I would tell stories that I knew were safer. I knew that they had had better success. They had more traditional 3-act structures. They had more traditional conflicts, but I was still, hammering down my fundamentals. So you want to make sure that you are doing both those things. Learn your really basic foundational elements of a short story, and then at the same time, push your limits, experiment, and test yourself. Even if you're not winning the contest, which it will probably take you a while to do, you will still be getting a really good education and growing your abilities. By the time that I finally won second place, those stories that were more ambitious and more experimental, they were starting to get good feedback from the judges, just like the ones that were more foundational and basic and salt of the earth fantasy. Another question from Janelle Crouch. She asks, do they have any suggestions about how many drafts your story should go through before submission? Earlier today, I was reading an article from the Writing Tips blog from David Farland. David Farland, if you don't know, is the pen name of Dave Wolverton, who is the coordinating judge of Writers of the Future. He writes sci-fi under Dave Wolverton, and he writes fantasy under David Farland. So if you Google the David Farland Writing Tips blog, you will come up with this great resource, and sometimes he even drops hints about what he looks for specifically at a certain time for submissions for the contest. He was talking about the submission process and talking about how people often think of editing as cutting things out of a story. They think of it as trimming down word count, taking out subplots, and all of that is important, especially in a short story where you are having to be so economic with your words. And yet, revising is also about putting things into each subsequent draft. Short stories and novels have a lot in them. You have to have character arcs, you have to have plot development, you have to set up your plot twists, you have to have themes that are reinforced, you have to have foreshadowing. So that's honestly too much to try to do all in one draft. If you try to do that in one draft, you will fail. So the best way to do it is each draft, choose a few elements that you're going to be inserting. So for me, in my process, I am not much of an outliner. I almost always am free writing my short stories. So my first draft is me figuring out what the story is about, figuring out the shape of the structure. Then my second draft is me going in, taking that structure, figuring out what works, what needs to be changed, what needs to be foreshadowed, adding in character arcs. And then in each draft, after that, I'll be doing a draft where I'm focusing on theme. I will be doing a draft where I'm focusing on setting, and then a draft where I'm polishing everything. So I could easily have 5 or 6 drafts before I send the story to a beta reader. And I am fortunate enough to have a great group of beta readers who give very insightful feedback. I try to communicate a very clear time frame for those people. I'll tell them, this is my absolute last submission deadline. This is when I would like to submit the story by. So this is when I really need my feedback from you so that I have time to implement your suggestions. So after I get the story back from them, I'll make those changes, and then I will do another draft of polishing before I submit it to the contest. So that is my process almost every time. However, the story I submitted that finally won me second place actually did not have any of that. I had been working on a different story for that deadline, and I realized that that story wasn't going to be done in time. So instead of trying to go ahead and rush that, I decided I would give it more time. I set it aside, and I started writing this new story based on the things I had been reading. So it had a lot of Arthurian myth in there as a background because I had been reading a lot of Idols of the King. Then it had a lot of comedic elements in there because I had been reading some Pratchett. I had been reading Kill the Farm Boy. I had been reading some other great comedic satiric fantasy. So I took those things, I combined them, I threw in a heist element, and I pumped out this story that ended up winning second place for that quarter. And I'm very happy with it. You can read it when you pre-order Writers of the Future Volume 38, which comes out in October. Other writers say, and other winners say that they had a similar experience where they worked really hard on all these stories and poured hours and hours into them. And then the story that won was something they wrote at the last minute for the deadline. I think the reason that is because you aren't overthinking things. You aren't being too heavy-handed with your editing. You're allowing yourself to be more instinctive and just to produce something that really flows out of your knowledge of archetype and story. One last question from Janelle Crouch. She asks, do they have a threshold for how weird a story can be? And I love this question because the threshold is whatever you can pull off. As I said, my personal process was to do every other one more experimental and every other one a bit safer, so that I was both making progress in my submissions and also making progress in my personal development as an author. The stories that end up winning the grand prize, the Golden Pen Award, in my observation, are the higher concept stories, and they are often hard sci-fi. There's this absolutely wonderful story that won grand prize in a recent year that was about a like plague that was sweeping through the world, and this was pre-pandemic actually. So it was about a plague sweeping through the world and these scientists trying to solve it. And it was just this great sort of science medical mystery that had a sci-fi element to it and just brought in a whole spread of elements. It was wonderful. I wish I could remember the author's name. I will try to put it in the comments when I think of it. So yes, that is my advice. Just be as weird as you want to be, pull off whatever your skills are capable of, and don't limit yourself. My last question from Gabriel Connor Salter. This one is going to be a little bit of a wild ride, so bear with me on this. Connor says, since this contest was created by L. Ron Hubbard, does it have connections to the Church of Scientology? So this is a really important question, and it's important for any contest or any magazine you submit to. You should always be researching the people involved and making sure that they're people who you want to do business with. That's just, a personal moral choice for everyone. For this contest, my understanding from what I've read on the website and what past winners and what the administrators have said is that the money for the contest comes from the literary estate of L. Ron Hubbard. So as I said, L. Ron Hubbard was an early publisher, prolific author of sci-fi and fantasy. He published Battlefield Earth is one of his better known works, and so a lot of the money comes from the sales of Battlefield Earth. And also the contest anthologies, they are bestsellers in their own right. A lot of them, they end up on a lot of bestseller lists. So this contest is self-sustaining. It publishes itself. The money from the Church of Scientology, I believe, is kept separate from the money of the L. Ron Hubbard estate. Also, none of the judges in this contest are Scientologists. Many of the administrators are, and the people who facilitate things are. And I've interacted with them. They are professionals in the industry, and they're lovely people to interact with. But the judges themselves come from a whole bunch of different backgrounds and worldviews and religions. There are Christians, there are Mormons, there are atheists. I don't believe actually any of them are Scientologists. So I think that the diversity of these worldviews and backgrounds and cultures contributes a lot to the diversity of the stories that they publish and the work that they do, which is one of the really cool things I love about it. The stories in the anthologies are judged blind, but I still think that the judges seek out stories from diverse perspectives and seek out things that are drawing on various cultural influences. So that's been a really cool thing. All right, so those are my tips for how to submit to the Writers of the Future contest. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in questions, and make sure to check out those people's websites and blogs from the video description. Also, check out other resources like the Writers of the Future podcast, where they interview industry professionals, and David Farland's Writing Tips blog. David Farland also has several groups, including the Apex Writers Group, to help aspiring authors like me. He has mentored people like Brandon Sanderson and Stephanie Meyer, so he knows whereof he speaks. Special thanks to James Kiddickpole, who produced this video and also produces the Crunchy Take podcast. Best of luck to all of you in your writing endeavors, and thank you for watching.